Ready? Okay, we're going to go live here, so I hope you have your makeup and everything on. We're going to be on camera. I hope you're, Mr. Jaquez, could you join the group? Thank you. Just kidding. Are our mics on? Make sure they're on, unless you don't want to do anything else. Before I open the meeting, the lady that manages the school board, I believe, had called me and wanted to thank us for the contribution that we did toward the video equipment that the town bought and we bought. And so on the 23rd at 5:30, they would like to have us come to the school board meeting at the administration building and give us a thank you. So I guess we have to announce that publicly, and we just did. And we won't be discussing any business.
23rd?
The 23rd, Monday night at
This coming Monday.
this coming Monday at 5:30. And we should support them. So occasionally I'd take time and go down there and listen to it. There's some really good things going on with our school system, and I'm quite proud of it. Okay.
This is at the school or
The school administration office.
administration?
I think it's 14th and Main. Okay? Got it? Ma'am, would you call roll, please?
Councilmember Meisner,
Here.
Councilmember Jaquez,
Here.
Councilmember Hamrick,
Here.
Councilmember Turner,
Here.
Councilmember Dorito,
Here.
Councilmember Gonzalez,
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Smith,
Here.
Mayor Troutman,
Here.
all present.
Okay, as you know, I hope you know, this is the Vision Committee meeting for the 18th of April. And a little bit of a change. If you would like to talk to council, I really would like you to sign up. Once I start, then we're not going to just have open mic at this meeting because we just aren't. That's what the mayor says. So if you want to talk to us, please just fill out a form because I don't want the interruptions unless I call you to the microphone. Okay? And I have one right now. So why don't we go ahead and go right to the audit report, supplement 1 of the 2A project. Mr. Patel, would you like to start off?
Honorable Mayor, members of City Council, in connection with the referendum 2A, we are required to have independent audit. And we hired Scott Wright, he's the independent CPA, and he conducted the audit on April 6th. We provide all the information he requested. We also answer all the questions he had, and he examined our record, and he's here to report to you what his findings are. So with that note, I'll turn over to Scott Wright.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council, thank you for letting me come this afternoon to present this report. I'll go through this fairly briefly and then be happy to answer any questions you might have. As Harry mentioned, I am an independent certified public accountant. In spirit of transparency, I'm also full-time employed by the town of Avon as their finance director, and I do several of these types of consulting and audit engagements for local governments. And I'm happy to be here in Canyon City. I've done a number of amount of work here and enjoy being here in Canyon City. When Harry contacted me about doing this work, the first thing I did was to review your special election and the ballot question, and to just familiarize myself with the requirements. And it really became quite apparent and about what the agreed upon procedures should be. And I wrote those up and presented those to Harry and Tony O'Rourke to agree upon what my work would consist of. And basically that was to ensure that the appropriate amount of sales and use taxes as approved in your ballot question were being collected, the additional 1%. that those taxes were being appropriately allocated and were being accounted for in a special capital projects fund, and that those revenues were being used only for street improvements, and even beyond that, that they were not being used for any types of personnel costs or purchases of equipment. So we came up with the procedures to be able to test and audit that. The first step that I did, Harry and his staff had sent me some preliminary materials. I reviewed the budget to ensure that the fund accounting structure was in place to actually receive these monies, and that they appeared to be appropriately budgeted for. And I did that. I reviewed your 2017 budget, and everything looked fine to me. The amount that was budgeted for the new revenues appeared to be correctly estimated based on prior years, and I found no exceptions in that. And that's actually item number 2 of my report. When I came to the town on April 6th, the first thing that I did was sat down and discussed the program, the street improvements program with Harry and also with Tony. Later in the day, I did a tour of the city with one of your engineers, and actually physically inspected the work that was performed in 2017. I have a list of the streets that we went down through. We were actually out in the city for about an hour and a half looking at the different streets and roads that were worked on. But going back after I did those interviews, then I began interviewing the members of the accounting staff, and I approached this as basically a limited risk assessment review. And what that means is that I did interviews and performed a walkthrough to ensure that the internal controls that Harry and that the staff said were in place were actually in place. So I traced certain accounting transactions all the way through the system. So from the start of the sales and use tax returns actually being filed, that the receipt of those funds into the bank and also into the general ledger, and then from a recap report that accumulates all of the sales and use taxes, and then at the end of the month there's an allocation, a mathematical allocation made, and a journal entry prepared that actually posts the 2% of the sales and use taxes to your general fund and the 1% to the street improvements fund. And the selection that I made in testing those transactions was I selected the top 10 sales and use tax merchants as far as the volume of revenues that they send in, and tested those all for each of the 12 months of the year. And then I also tested that final adjusting journal entry that posts those transactions into the general ledger for that special fund. And there were no exceptions to any of that. So that's really the first 2 items of my report. The third item that was specified in the ballot question is that the expenditures are prioritized and take place in accordance with your the city's pavement management plan. I reviewed that plan. It provides, it's not so specific as to name the specific streets that needed to be repaired and addressed, but it did identify in general the condition, the large percentage of the poor conditions of some of the streets. And then in talking with, again, with Tony and Harry and Ted Dell, the engineer, and going beyond that pavement management report to understand the software and the processes that they use internally to identify those streets and what made sense from the standpoint of timing, from the standpoint of addressing the worst of the needs in that initial year. In addition to that, then I did review the ordinance and the budget amendments that allowed you to more fully address those issues with the transfer of the excess monies, $5 million from I think 3 or 4 of your different funds into this special improvement fund, and to appropriate those so that you actually had an adequate amount of money to address this initial need for 2017. Again, I didn't find any exceptions to that, to how the priority was addressed within that plan and within the internal work that your staff did. The fourth item was to review, and it's not specific to the referendum, but I did review the construction contract, and just to kind of, again, familiarize myself with how you went about selecting the contractor to do this work. And I didn't find any exceptions to what you would normally see in a design-build contract of that nature. And then finally, there were the actual expenditures that were coded to the Street Improvement Fund, and I reviewed those specific expenditures. There were approximately 9 or 10 of those. I tied those back to the monthly progress reports that the contractor submits and that the engineers approve. I vouched. What we call vouching is basically examining the check, the backup documentation, the coding, the invoice, to make sure it mathematically foots and cross-foots, and any other supporting documentation. And I examined every expenditure within that fund, and again, I found no exceptions to any of those, the actual expenditure of the monies. That was really the procedures. There's one thing I might note that's slightly different. The American Institute of Certified Public Accountants normally requires language within these types of agreed-upon procedures that limits the who should actually view these reports to the parties identified. Because of the nature of this work and how it was worded within the referendum, that this be available for public review, I took that information out of my report. So this report is available to, obviously to you, but to your citizens and so forth to review as well. So that's my report. It's fairly brief. I was here for approximately 7 or 8 hours on April 6th. Again, a lot of it was just becoming familiar with your operations, but there were no exceptions that and there was nothing else that came to my attention not included in any of these procedures that I would report to you as an independent accountant. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Scott. Any questions on council? Mr. Meisner.
You had mentioned that you took this information because it was available to the public and pulled it out?
Well, normally.
Clarify that last statement you made about the public.
Normally, normally there would be, in these types of what we call agreed-upon procedures, engagements, there would be a paragraph that would restrict who would
Right.
actually have availability to this information. I've eliminated that because of what's stated in your referendum, that this is for a public review. I just wanted you to be aware of that.
You eliminated that paragraph.
I eliminated
Okay.
that, what's normally a required paragraph on
Okay.
behalf of the AICPA. Yeah.
Mr. Hammer?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Wright, for this pretty interesting. I do have one question. Having been on the 2A Streets Committee, I know one of the concerns citizens expressed was to make sure that the funds that were generated by this tax were only used for street improvements and not for maintenance or other street department activities. And did your audit reach a conclusion there?
Yes, those expenditures were solely related to the construction contract related to the actual street improvements. I saw no other expenditures, and obviously if there are other expenditures, you can get into a gray area of whether or not it's a betterment or a maintenance item, but there were no expenditures outside of that contract, so which made that fairly straightforward.
Thank you.
Ms. Smith?
I just received your basic report, but is there some documentation with numbers of money spent and reviewed that we could also see?
There will be a separate audit going on next week for the city, and we'll be preparing the financial statement for for that reason, and we'll provide you the audited number at that time.
Okay.
Anyone else on the panel? Questions? Okay. Mr. Meising, excuse me.
I just want to go back. I assume this is normal. I just find it odd that we've got the written verbiage, but there's no mention of any numbers in here. And I assume that that's a normal relative to this type of public audit.
That's
Because
correct.
one of the things the public wants, I believe, was to see 100,000 on the left and 100,000 on the right.
Right.
And I realize you're verifying that with these statements, but the lack of those numbers is somewhat of a concern.
Yeah, so this was not an independent audit of your basic financial statements that, as Harry mentioned, will be forthcoming to you as a matter of just the normal annual review. That, for me to have done that would be redundant. It wouldn't have been in your best interest. What we really focused on was what was required of coming out of the referendum. But it was outside of my scope to do any kind of financial statements, and in fact, I wouldn't have been able to opine on those anyway, just because of the limited scope of this engagement.
Do you think that's going to satisfy the 2A? I mean, I realize we get into this trust issue.
Because it needed to be independently done and separate from
Right.
normal city staff. But the audit itself is done independently as well.
Yes, second audit also for the city is doing independently, separate fund, not by Scott. It will be done by separate fund.
Can you read, I don't have a copy of the referendum with me, it looks like you do. Can you read the part that talks about the independent audit?
Well, I have it highlighted, actually. It says, with such expenditures to be subject to an annual independent audit, an audit report to be made available for public review.
It's just expenditures.
And I think it was to ensure that that money, and I think the intent, and John, you can help me with this. The intent was to make sure that money, the street money stayed in the street fund and didn't go anywhere
Right.
else.
I don't disagree with the intent.
Right.
And I agree.
Are you comfortable with that?
Yes,
Where we're
yes,
at.
I am. I am comfortable.
Yeah, so there are really two parts of, so part of, many times the financial audit is, would not include some of the procedures that I did. And obviously, I can't opine upon the entire financial, basic financial statements and footnotes of the city. So they're really kind of, I think they're, I believe, at least in my opinion, that the intent of the ballot question is being addressed by both of these audits independently of each other. That's my opinion. And in fact, I asked, that was one of the first questions I asked of Harry when we talked about this, was how come Wendy is not doing this part of it? And he answered that you as the council wanted to have these procedures done separately from your normal independent audit, the financial audit.
Right, and in light of spotlights being put on our 2A project in general, I think I really appreciate having the independent auditor that's independent of our normal independent auditor,
Right.
to really show that, that we are seeking transparency and ensuring that this money is being spent appropriately in the way that it should be and in the right categories. So I'm glad that the Citizens Committee had that foresight.
In reality, this will be, these particular types of audit will be done twice. Another independent auditor will do the testing for these funds again, apart from what he did. And they will have their own report, separate from the Scott's report. So practically, this fund will be audited 2 times.
Any questions? Ms. Ma'am?
I just have one question about section 1 of your report.
Yes.
You said you reviewed the tax returns that came into the city from sales and use taxes. Just a point of clarification. You said you randomly selected them, but you said you took the 10 highest remitters. So, I mean, I think technically it's probably not random, but I just wanted to clarify that.
Well, it was random within those 10, which months I took.
Which months?
Which months I
Okay,
used. So,
okay.
yeah,
Thank you
yes.
for that clarification.
yeah, sorry.
Any other questions for council? Okay, then.
Yeah, I do.
Mhm.
But then you go on to say that you use those entries for each month. I got the impression that you used the same, if we call them vendors, for the same, you used the same vendors each month. Is that not what you did?
No, I took the top 10, and then we selected 2 randomly for each month, for each of the 12 months of the year, and traced those 2. So they were, use of the word randomly maybe is not technically, maybe not technically accurate, I guess, if you're a statistician, but.
Or if you're a stickler.
On any
The
given-
reason I did that was obviously the impact of the sales taxes. I mean, normally in an organization, it's my experience that the top 10 sales taxpayers would possibly be remitting up to 50% of your total sales tax in a community. So that was the reason for just selecting those and not really doing a totally random sample.
But we did not use the tax returns. God, can you turn this down? You did not use the monthly returns from the 10 highest remitters each month.
I did not do 10 each month, no.
I think you just said you selected 2, is that right?
2.
Yes.
That paragraph probably needs to be clarified.
By who? By the accountant?
Well, it's just confusing that,
Can it say that he took 24
Does-
different samples from 2 different,
the way it's stated, it suggests, or at least is my interpretation, that you used the 10 highest tax returns through that one-year period, which we didn't do, and I'm just clarifying here. We basically used 2 of the highest 10 each month that were going to be potentially different. Is that correct? If they're random, they're not the same.
Right. Yeah, I think you could state it that way, yes.
How else would you state it?
I don't-
And
I
I'm
have
being
to
an
think about
advocate
it.
here of somebody else looking at this report,
Mhm.
that when you read it initially, you get the impression it's 10 over the period of the year, and it's not. It's 2 per month.
Well, maybe it's better to say it's 24, 24 tests selected from the,
Okay,
from
maybe.
the top 10 sales tax payers or remitters for the,
Just a
for
minor
the
verbiage
year.
thing.
Yeah, I understand, yeah.
Would you,
Believe me, this is, this is normal.
are you,
I'd be happy to change that if
you're
that's.
sort of,
Well, just some kind of clarification that we're not talking about 10.
he's a CPA, I mean, he just say, well, we're normal.
Can I ask a question?
But, yes, sir.
Overall, how many businesses did you actually look at for the entire year? How many? 2, 10, 24? How many did you look at?
10.
Okay, there you go.
Do you feel comfortable with a slight rewording of that? Because the public is going to look at it, and we would not have any more confusion than we have.
Yeah, why don't I, I'll redline that, submit it to Harry and Tony, and see if that's acceptable
Okay.
to them, and then if so, then we'll issue the report. then.
Okay, thank you a lot.
One of the slight changes where you say of, you could maybe say from. Because you say of the 10 highest, and maybe if you said from, it would minimize some potential misinterpretation.
Okay. I understand what your point.
Yeah.
Even though just I randomly selected 2 monthly tax returns from the 10 highest remitters. I think that's a little bit, kind of clarifies it just like that.
Okay. Any comments, questions?
Thank you very much, and
Thank-
Harry?
thank you.
Good job as usual.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
All right. I don't know if we need to accept this, it's just the way it is. It's just, we've asked for a report and we got it.
I don't know. We have to accept the other one? We accept the
Yes.
other audit, but probably would make sense to present this as a item on the agenda and then accept it officially?
Okay, let's
do
get the
that.
form then, if we're
We
going to
can-
have.
We
if
can
we're gonna
schedule
have-
for May the 7th.
If we're going to have any changes, let's bring it back for acceptance at another meeting.
May 7th?
May 7th is fine. Okay?
Great. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Scott.
Scott. Thanks so much. Scott, would you just, wait, we're going to have Paul Fisher would like to talk about the audit report. Mr. Fisher, in case there's some questions of you, Scott.
Paul Fisher, 299 Savage Loop,
Is your
Canyon
mic
City.
on, Paul?
There's a green light on.
Good, good. Just testing.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I
Is that better?
We can hear you now.
All right, try it again. I also was a member of the 2A Fix Our Streets Committee, and I fully came here this afternoon to hear the financial report, which would include the financial statements of the Capital Improvement Fund to rebuild our streets. So I'm disappointed. Now, do I have to wait till the city completes their overall audit and then try to dig that part out of the audit? Because I'm going to look at it. I want to see that. And is that going to be made available to the public, your entire audit that comes out later? Because a written report's one thing, but if you can show me the financial statements that show where the money comes in and where the money goes out, then I'm going to be satisfied.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, well,
Harry-
absolutely, yes. And Harry, can it be
Yes.
condensed so that just the street part can be, the street part will be in the big overall document, but can that section also be transferred over into the street?
Yeah, it's,
posted online and
Paul wants to
available?
do unaudited numbers, we can provide you the unaudited number.
I mean, you could just provide a printout of that GL, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me
And-
take a look at that, and then
Yeah.
I'll decide if
Only
that's
thing is,
satisfactory
you
or not.
understand that will be unaudited number, so auditors sometimes come up with the, some adjustment, but it could be a minor.
Yeah, I understand there's
But otherwise,
adjustments
overall-
from time to
overall
time.
numbers are correct.
And when is that taking place, Harry?
Next week on the 23rd.
On next
On the
week?
week of 23rd.
And so what,
So you should have it by end of the month.
so here's a question. If we would have had Scott do the audit of the numbers, in particular, money coming in, money coming out, all those statements, would our other independent auditor have to go and still do the same thing again?
Yes.
Even though
Yes,
it's
they
already
will.
been
Yes,
done
they
by
have to
Scott?
do that. But we will have some numbers for you on May 17th meeting if they want. If you want May 17th meeting, we can provide you. If you want earlier number, I can give you the number, but with the condition that they will be unaudited numbers.
That's fine, but then will the final audit be available for public review?
Right.
Yes.
Always, always
Okay.
is.
Always. It's
Okay.
always available.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul. All right, thank you. I think we are now hopefully done. All right, before we move on to the riverfront zone, the commercial zone, is there anyone in the audience that would like to discuss or talk to council about any of those? Because once we start, we're not going to be chiming in and interrupting each other. So if you'd like to come talk about the next two items on the agenda, or the riverfront zone district creation, and the next one after that is the commercial zone district recalibration. If anyone out there would like to discuss any of those, fill out a form and bring it up here, and I'll call you. Okay. All right. Ms. Svetlik, would you like to go forward?
Sure. So good afternoon, Mayor, members of council. I will be talking about some numbers, but they won't have dollar signs in front of them, and have some words and have some pictures for you. So I'm going to start out by talking about the Riverfront Zone District creation. And I think before we get into more detail about that specifically, I want to go through a little bit of an overview of just what is zoning and what is zoning versus land use. So I have a couple of slides for that. And hopefully that not only helps perhaps you all, but the general public that are in the audience or watching this on tape. So first, land use versus zoning. So land use is very general in nature, and the land uses are typically found in a city's comprehensive plan or an adopted amendment to that comprehensive plan. And the City of Canyon City has a couple of documents like that, which include the Arkansas River Corridor Master Plan. Versus zoning, which is very specific, and that's located and noted within the city's municipal code. So a bit more about zoning. There's really two parts to zoning. The first part is the written regulations, sort of what is the setback, what is the use, how should something be displayed on the site. That's the written regulations part of zoning codes. And the second component is the zoning map. So where does that language apply within a specific geographic area of the city? So there's really two components to consider within zoning. And moving back even more broadly, there's really about 100 years of history with zoning in the United States. It really began with the State Standard Zoning Enabling Act of 1924 that enables states to enact zoning laws. Zoning is a police power of the local governments to exercise authority over privately owned real property. And also for nearly, well, before I get into that, this is actually an excerpt on the right of the first zoning code in the United States, which occurred in Los Angeles in 1904, which is the first time that any type of zoning was enacted in the United States. So also for nearly 100 years, we've had zoning in Canyon City. The earliest zoning map that we could find, at least, dates to about 1928, and this is a copy of that zoning map, which at the time was pretty much done with colored pencils on parchment paper. So the city of Canyon City has had zoning for nearly 90 years. And obviously the geographic area of the city at the time was basically original Canyon and sort of the Old North Canyon areas. And we just pulled this information, thought it's important to note how the population's changed over time. Population of the city at that time was about 5,600. So then we jump forward to, we found a copy of the zoning map from 1976 for the city. Obviously you can see how the city's grown here. Includes South Canyon, some Lincoln Park areas. East Canyon is now within the city, and then obviously various post-World War II subdivisions that have been added into the city. And the population of the city in 1976 was about 11.5. So jumping forward again, we have a zoning map from 2004. We now see the purple amoeba of 4 Mile added into the city, and at that time the population was about 15,800. And then of course we have our current zoning map, and that's now maintained in GIS, Geographic Information Systems, and so any rezonings that typically occur over the course of a year, the map is updated more readily for folks to have that available online. And we did, I know a month or so ago, we actually printed copies of the zoning map that you should have up on the dais, and we have a large copy behind the screen here on the wall. So now moving into the riverfront zoning. Why are we talking about this? Why are we talking about doing riverfront zoning in Canyon City? The Arkansas River Corridor Master Plan, which was adopted in December of 2017, had one of its near-term implementation items to create riverfront zoning. And the master plan basically proposed the possibility of having 2 zone districts, a riverfront residential and a riverfront mixed-use zone district. So the riverfront zoning basically does not currently exist within Canyon City. If we look at the riverfront area, we can see that currently it's zoned primarily industrial. And if you go back and look at those historic zoning maps, basically a majority of the land adjacent to the riverfront, specifically close into downtown, which is where we want the most revitalization to occur, has always been zoned industrial. And that's one of the things that we talked about a lot during the master plan, is that we need to change that land use and then provide the zoning to encourage mixed-use development and redevelopment of our riverfront. So basically the current zoning in the focus area, and when I say focus area, I generally mean between 1st and 11th Streets. Again, that was the focus area identified in the Arkansas River Corridor Master Plan in terms of modifying the land use, which was done by virtue of adoption of the master plan, and then the recommendations for creating new zoning. And so for the most part right now, these areas are zoned industrial, and there's some areas that are zoned general commercial. So stepping back a bit to the Arkansas River Corridor Master Plan, again, the first step is to actually identify the land use. And so that, again, was done by virtue of adoption of the master plan in December. The new land uses as the first step, sort of, or the canvas to start building on the next steps of revitalization occurred during adoption of that master plan by identifying new land use categories, which are very similar in titles. So we have a riverfront mixed-use area that was identified and a riverfront residential area that was identified from a land use standpoint. And again, that being adopted becomes an amendment to the city's comprehensive plan. So that's, again, at the land use level. So going back to zoning, why do we want to do this? So we want to begin the implementation of the Arkansas River Corridor Master Plan, have updated, appropriate, clear-to-use codes, which is really critical to the first step for reinvestment of any area of a community. It's really important to provide clarity and predictability for existing landowners and prospective landowners coming in and having interest in the area. And of course, we want to support riverfront redevelopment and having the appropriate code for the context. And what I mean by that is the code language specific to the riverfront or properties adjacent to the riverfront may be very different than the code language that is for parts of East Canyon in and around, say, where the Walmart is or where Home Depot is, right? That's going to be very different. It's very different context. So the geographic area, what are we considering for this? We're generally, again, considering along the riverfront. Again, we initially envisioned this to be focused primarily from 1st to 11th Streets. But it is important to note at this time, as we begin or may begin this work, that at this time anyway, we're proposing to only create the language, right? So just the part on the left, right, the written language, and create the new district, but not necessarily go through the mapping exercise as part of this process. At least that's what we're currently proposing, and are looking for council's input on that. So what are some different items to consider when you're creating riverfront zoning? You know, what are those critical considerations? What are the current trends for riverfront zoning? What's happening around us in some of the surrounding communities in Colorado? What's happening on a national level to create zoning codes that really encourage a vibrant riverfront area that we envision for the future in Canyon City? What is needed from an urban form standpoint? Meaning, what sort of setbacks do we want? How do we assure that sort of the front door for this development faces the river, right? We often want front doors to face Main Street or to face a public street. In this case, it's really important to have the front face the river, and so how do we create code language that supports and reinforces that? How tall do we want the buildings to be? Do we want step backs or setbacks of the buildings to make sure that we're allowing for light and air to come down to, say, a future river walk along the river's edge? What are the mix of uses that are envisioned for this area and that should be accommodated? And then, you know, just really importantly, this is a big time for the city. As you saw with some of those early zoning maps, historically, this area has also always been zoned industrial. And so Canyon City is at the very beginning point of where many communities across the United States have gone over the last 30 years now on really taking back their riverfronts. And as the industrial uses have sort of died off and moved into other locations, people are really reclaiming that land. And so how do we really do this to create a legacy for the city long term? So in terms of a potential schedule, actually the first two bullets are occurring right now. I think I may have mentioned previously, but we're lucky to have a University of Colorado Denver capstone student. So that's somebody who is working on their final project towards their master's degree in planning, is actually looking at this issue for the city. And they will be presenting some of their initial findings actually next week at the Planning Commission meeting. So we encourage everybody to listen to that or watch the tape of that. And then the city is due to receive the student's final report in early May. And so staff will then start looking through that and see what information comes from that input that's valuable to carry forward. But then as we're moving forward with this work, staff's work will really begin in earnest in May, and we're estimating that we will really need through about September to really create the language and the code that's needed for the riverfront, since this is basically creating brand new zone districts. We envision, of course, additional planning commission and council work sessions and meetings, and those are to be determined during that process. And with the goal of potentially having this new riverfront zoning, again, just the language, not the mapping portion of it, completed by October of this year. So with that, I'd like to go through the commercial piece and then maybe take all questions at the end, if that's okay. It might make sense to see the two of them together.
Any questions of council?
Not if she's gonna.
Okay, holding the questions. So moving on to the commercial zone district calibration. So again, why do we want to consider doing this? And notice that I specifically were using the word calibration here, not creation, because we obviously have 2 existing commercial districts within the city. But the reason that we're looking at this is really, the first bullet there is paramount. One size does not fit all, and I'll get into that a little bit further. But again, this is an implementation step that has been identified by one of the city's adopted plans, and that's the US 50 corridor plan that was adopted in, I believe, 2015 now. Some of the current language is really vague. In our commercial zone district language, there are 0 illustrations in the code, and as staff has been working with us over the past several months, we've really found that some of the definitions are vague and sometimes some things aren't very clear. And from what we can tell, the last updates really that were done were completed in 1991. And then I pulled back in the zoning map from 1976 because what I noted there is this is really the first time that we actually see the reference to 2 separate commercial districts, the exact language and names that we have currently. So splitting out between general commercial and the central business district. So at least going back to 1976, those 2 districts have existed, and we haven't been able to actually pull out the language from 1976, but it would be interesting to do that to see how much has actually changed or not since that time frame up to the current code, which dates to 1991. So going back to the one size does not fit all, and focusing first on the central business district. So the black outline that you see there is the outline of the historic district. There are properties that are basically in the central business district zone district that are both within and not within the historic district boundaries, but there's really no distinction in any of our codes. There's really no protection for the buildings in the historic district, and typically communities that have historic districts as valuable as Canyon Cities will either have that language in their code and have standards and or guidelines that are potentially overlays to the underlying zone district. And the example that I inserted here is from City of Littleton. If any of you have been to Littleton, Littleton has a pretty successful historic district, and they actually have maybe too much. They have the underlying zoning, as well as they have a set of standards and guidelines for the non-contributing buildings of the downtown area and the historic district, and then they have a separate set of guidelines specifically for historic buildings. And I'm familiar with that a bit because I actually worked with the city for a few years applying those in their downtown area. So it's just an example of how different communities that have historic districts in their downtowns have a set of guides or standards to try to protect that resource, which is very much closely tied to economic development and an attractor for folks coming to the community. So then moving on to the general commercial district. Again, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. The properties vary greatly in size. Again, I'll use the word context, and you'll probably hear me and Patrick and other members of staff use that term a lot. The context is significantly different from, say, downtown on US 50, which is the image on the left here, where the parcels are pretty much the same. They were part of original Canyon, and when those were platted, the parcels are basically about 44 by 120 feet. And then you move to sort of the East Canyon area where the parcels get a little bit bigger, and those are anywhere from kind of a ½ acre to 5 acres in size. And then again, as you continue to move east, kind of the eastern gateway to the community where you have, again, Walmart and Home Depot and some of the big boxes, the parcel sizes are tremendously different. So those are anywhere from 5 to 15 plus acres in size. And right now we have one zone district covering all of those different contexts and different parcel sizes. So another reason to consider updating the commercial zone districts is having much more of a user-friendly document. So having illustrations, having clear definitions, And then really considering maybe modifying the type of code from what is known as a pure Euclidean code, which was a lot of the initial codes that came out and basically is what our code is, which is a lot of writing and no illustrations and focusing on a lot of separation of uses. And we're suggesting that perhaps we go towards more of a hybrid code that still talks about uses, but also includes a lot more information about the form and the urban place that we're trying to create in the city. And so the graphic that you see on the right here, it's a bit difficult to see, but it's from actually a set of standards from Iowa City. It's actually a riverfront context as well. But just within their downtown, they have really calibrated and they have several different sub-districts with specific language for each of those areas. And the one piece that you may not be able to see here are the black lines that are indicated on certain frontages. This is another tool that's become more popular in the last few years, basically having a line on the map that basically is showing you're required to have ground floor retail in those areas because you want to encourage that lively street frontage. And so that's just another tool in a way within a code to represent very clearly where we want ground floor retail, as opposed to maybe where you're okay having ground floor living quarters or other types of uses within the core downtown area. So having additional graphics from that standpoint, having a table format, tables that indicate a little bit more, see if there's a way to more user-friendly in terms of what uses are approved and permitted and where they may be located in terms of any sort of sub-district. So again, having it more user-friendly and graphic-friendly. And having other illustrations like these. So illustrations that show anything from how a building sits on a property based on the district it is in, to quick sections that show the transition from the public realm of the street to, say, a semi-private realm of a residence, and how that may look. And then simple diagrams indicating appropriate ways for parking to be accommodated on different sites. So again, just having other illustrations incorporated into the code. We have none of those right now. So where would this apply? This would apply obviously to the entire city, to any commercial area or area that was deemed commercial. So it'd be citywide. And in this process, we would propose going through the remapping process as part of the updates to the code. So items to consider here, what needs, what's working, what's not working from a commercial zone district standpoint. What are the major deficiencies in the current language? We talked a little bit about some of the things that staff's noticing in terms of items aren't clear, definitions perhaps are missing that really should be in. For clarity's sake, do the current regulations really work for the current historic district? What are the current trends? Quite frankly, within codes, and I touched a little bit upon that in terms of adding in more of the graphics and illustrations to make it more user-friendly. What's needed to accommodate everything from small inline retail to large big box retail, and where is the appropriate threshold changes for these districts? Geographically, where is that change from zone A to B to C? So in this, again, we're lucky to have a UC Denver capstone student doing some background work on us. Again, they'll be providing their initial presentation of where they are to Planning Commission next Wednesday. And we'll have their final information by early May. And so then a potential schedule on this work, if council would like to move forward with this, would be to begin that in earnest from a staff level in September. So we would focus first on the riverfront work and have that completed, and then potentially shift and focus beginning work on the commercial district work. A key thing to note here is obviously we're talking about potentially remapping, so that will require open houses. That will have to be budgeted, so then that would be considered as part of a potential 2019 budget item. And that it's also important to note that there's potential funding opportunities through History Colorado and DOLA. And I know that there's actually a representative coming here soon, I believe on the May 23rd Vision Committee meeting, to provide some information there. But there's funding opportunities that could potentially help the city with at least the historic component to this. So it's really up to council on, your desire to move forward with this after the riverfront work is done, and just want to hear your thoughts. So that's all I have. Oh, nope, I have one more thing. Why should we do this? The city's sesquicentennial anniversary is coming up in 2022. The city was incorporated on, I've actually found two different sources, April 2nd or April 3rd of 1872. And so we are 4 short years away from a pretty big celebration. And having some of these things updated and ready to go for that celebration, I think are some of the goals to work towards and a reason to have some of these things updated and finalized before that celebration, and maybe some new developments actually in place for that celebration utilizing the new code. And for those that don't know, Murray's Hall, so 305 Main Street, this building right here, is where the incorporation took place of the city, and that building still exists on Main Street, so, and doesn't have a plaque. So that's all I have. Looking for input.
Questions from council? Input?
I'll start.
Well, Mr. Mayor, I think by the time we have our sesquicentennial, it'll be about almost around 30 years since we've updated, and it's probably time to have some updates.
Okay. Thank you, Dean. That's very informative. Appreciate that. I know that we often here get into that question that the changes and stuff, and it didn't keep up. The zoning is stagnant and it stayed there, so we have to make exceptions and put a new verbiage, and hopefully we can move away from that with updating it to today's standards and maybe some future standards. So I appreciate what you've done. I think that people should pay attention and come out to the open houses to see what we're doing and give their input. I think that would be great. Mr. Meisner.
Good work.
Thank you.
I think the riverfront zoning creation makes sense. And obviously the commercial zone recalibration makes sense. My concern comes when we start doing the mapping and the emotional stress that that's going to cause, as you're familiar with when we started the river plan.
Mm-hmm.
And I would again ask that as soon as we start identifying, before we present any maps that identify private land changes, that those people that are being potentially, their land is potentially impacted by that change, that we proactively communicate with those people about what really is happening, and that it's not an immediate thing in that whole process.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I specifically mentioned that specifically for the commercial work, if we go through the remapping, that is a rezoning process, and so there are the public notice requirements as part of that process. But that's why we want to, it's a much bigger effort and need to consider that potentially in terms of the 2019 budget.
And I think that's very important 2 ways. The people that can be impacted, and then also with regards to looking at how we wanted to develop it. You know, so that someone that wants to come in already has an idea that this is here, but these folks are kind of at in a sense, a no at right now. So we don't have a conflict with that. So it gives both parties. It gives them, and mainly the people that are along the riverfront. It gives them that assurance that we understand their concerns and stuff like that. But that would be something that would be dealt with if, say, I wanted to go to you as an individual person to acquire a piece of your land with regards to the riverfront.
Mr. Hammer?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. One question or comment, I guess, on the process. It would seem to me that it would be my desire, let me put it that way, that when staff comes to some conclusions about changes that need to be made, that council act as a valve or a feedback loop on some of those changes before they're presented in a public meeting.
Mhm. Right, and I think as I identified the, at least specifically for the commercial component of it, because we are proposing to do the remapping, there would be additional, obviously, planning commission sessions on this and council work sessions
Council work
as part
sessions.
of the process.
Thank you.
Mr. Meisner?
You mentioned the two different studies from the capstone. Are those two different students, or are those the
They're
same?
two separate students.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Dina, I was going to say that this is an extremely exciting project to see, the potential of what it could bring to Canyon City, getting it a little bit more hospitable for commercial and some things like that to get down on Riverfront. But not to re-echo some of the sentiment of my other councilmen and women, but might I suggest that when we do notify them, we do it maybe with certified mail, or I know it's an added expense, but that way we know that they've got it, and maybe do that before, like Jim had mentioned before, it's released publicly, because this is a very emotional thing, and with certified mail, that it covers our staff as well as them. That way there's no doubting whether or not they receive notification to be involved in this and just be aware of the process. Whereas, with the highway frontage and with our downtown business survey, I have received, feedback of, well, what's going on with this? I hear it affects me, and I would much rather them hear it from us one-on-one and directly, and eliminate any chance of fiction, and make sure it's always replaced with fact.
Yeah,
Well,
and that's important, because you're talking about, having the budget for all this for 2018. If we put that into it, that would be part of that process.
Right.
Is how many folks would this impact
Well,
on average?
I honestly have no idea. We haven't really looked. I mean, I think the requirements are within 300 feet of any rezoning. Is that correct? So, I mean, literally, if you take all of the current commercial zone districts and do a bubble around of everything within 300 feet, and that's why we want to have the discussion now, because if we want to go that route, absolutely, we need to calculate that and factor that into the budget process.
Yeah, well, I would agree that it's a highly emotional subject, and we need to include our.
I wouldn't be so concerned about which I've mentioned before, the registered mail to that 300 radius, but to the landowners.
Yes.
To the landowner.
Yes.
To
Yeah.
make
Okay.
for sure that the people that own that land have been notified. And one of the problems we get into is that we mail it out, but we have no way of knowing what happened to that letter.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification. That's really what I intended. I don't know that necessarily the neighbors need to have the added expense of registered mail, but, I do think the people that are the registered landowners are the ones that I intended in my comment.
Okay,
Good job.
good. Thank you again.
Well done.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we're done?
Well, Mr. Mayor, if I can request that we revisit number 1 for just a minute on our agenda, if we're done with number 2 and 3.
Is that okay with council? Go ahead.
I just felt like, although I feel very confident that the independent audit demonstrates beyond doubt that the money was spent appropriately in the right way, I'm having a hard time having it settling well with me, knowing that we need to be way above and beyond any type of criticism, and wonder if it might be worth the added expense to have a double audit on the numbers and expenditures themselves.
Isn't that what's occurring? You're having the regular, and then you're having an audit of just the 1A, 2A.
Right. We
If
just
just
had a
2A, just the 2A monies is being done by an independent auditor, but it's not independently being audited.
Yeah, 2A was done by independent auditor. And then the regular city audits also incorporate the 2A audits.
So what Ms. Smith is saying is, the city audit, I got that. That's the big books thing. What Ms. Smith is talking about is a separate audit just for that one particular category, so that we can be squeaky clean, that the two aren't mixed together.
And is being spent appropriately.
I guess, I didn't want to make a big issue of it, but I will again. I don't criticize this report, and I don't want to offend anybody. I would have felt much more comfortable in all of these numbers that he compared if he'd have showed those numbers. And I realize, I just find it odd that we're going to do a certified audit, and we're going to state that it's certified, but we're not going to present the numbers that verify that it's certified. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but this audit was only for double checking our accounting for expenditures and revenues are correct. They did not put together the financial statement. They just looked at all the transaction what we recorded into this fund is according to what referendum requires. That's what they are certifying.
So my question as a taxpayer, not sitting up here, is, in item one, how many dollars are we talking about? If that number were there, we wouldn't have to ask that question. Am I out of line here?
What, you're gonna get that in the financial statement. I think
Right.
you're mixing the term audit with financial statement, they're two separate things.
I'm
This
just wondering
required
if
a
the
separate
financial
audit.
statement
what is
needs
the-
to be independently done as well.
It's going to be
Right.
independently
I mean,
done.
independent of the,
Independent of our independent auditor?
by Scott.
I mean, if you want to incur that expense,
Well,
it's just.
what's the 2A thing say again? Does it not mention
says
audit?
Independent audit,
It's
which you
just,
conducted,
Yeah, but it's also verifying the expenditures.
yeah.
All right, I think the
Doesn't
pleasure
say
of council is just to cut through this, or,
Yeah.
because we have a meeting coming up next, is we want an independent audit of just that street money, period. Is that what I'm saying? And so I'm hearing.
Independent financial statement, not audit.
Independent financial statement. I know the city's gonna do one, they're
Yeah.
gonna do that too. But
Yeah,
I
I know-
think
yeah, I
we
know
need,
it's-
is that what you're saying?
Is the audit that's being done next week done by a third party?
Yes.
Third-party independent audit for
And
the
is it the
entire
same-
city, for all the
Everything.
For the
funds.
entire
It's
city.
The entire city.
It's the same,
It will
audit.
include this because it includes
Yes.
the entire city.
Exactly.
Right.
Is there a
Includes
way
it.
of combining the two as far as using the numbers from the independent audit next week and attaching the statement from this independent auditor saying he verified these funds
No,
were
Well-
spent
He
on
won't-
2A?
he won't do that.
Because I'm the farthest removed council
Yeah.
person from when 2A was originally passed in inception, and I was looking at that thinking, just from an unbiased perspective, I'm like, man, this is looks like no audit I've seen. I'd like to, when I hear audit, I think of numbers. I'm looking
You're
for some
thinking
sort of.
financial statement.
Yeah, I'm looking for a cash in and a cash out, and it doesn't have to be a full-blown, but I think some numbers verifying that would be appropriate.
I mean, I would think that you could take the general ledger and create a very
I can
simplified.
give you the numbers, that includes, but that's not, he audited, he audited his transactions.
Yeah.
When you combine that transaction into the financial statement, that's a different thing.
And that's what I'm
And
saying,
if you
perhaps
want
we-
total revenue, how much was that, and how many expenditures was, I can give you that.
But I'm saying just to be clearly above and beyond any type of criticism and make sure that we're staying within the referendum that was stated, that it would be independently done, independent of our independent auditor. We might need to be redundant and have it done twice, once by our normal independent auditor and by Scott as well, so we can have the 2A expenditures clearly done and above and beyond any reproach whatsoever.
And we certainly can do that if you would like to, but that's what not we hired him for. We hired him for checking the transactions, what we recorded under the 2A.
Yes, and I
But if you
appreci-
want
and I
to
appreciate
create
that
a
was well done.
financial statement, we can hire him and doing the again.
I
same
think
thing.
I would be more comfortable with that.
I don't care what you call it, financial statement, audit, I think it would be a little clearer to the layman that if they had this audit that had numbers attached to it, that said we collected $1.64 million and that we spent $1.64 million. I think that's what people are looking for, and in that, they're wanting to see the $10 check that was written to Tony. I mean, you know what I'm saying? They want to see those amounts. And while technically the audit may have been satisfied, I think from a practical standpoint, in what that group was trying to get, and the people that voted for it, they wanted to be able to say, you got $10 and you spent $10.
And since they already, I'm just throwing you the idea, since they already did the transaction audit, we have general ledger detail here. I can attach to that, if you want, that has the same number what they audited.
That may work.
And to me, as long as there's some sort of numbers in, numbers out, that's the key. Essentially, we may call what Scott did an audit, but in my mind, what he did was really more of a verification of funds. Am I correct in that, Mr. Patel?
Verifications of transactions, yeah,
so
what we recorded.
a payment made to contractor X,
Right.
made to this street for this
Right.
explicit purpose and not for
And plus-
paving the city parking lot.
And plus what we collected, 1% is appropriately recorded into the particular fund. That's what he checked. He checked all the revenue we are supposed to record in this fund is recorded. And all the expenditures, what we are supposed to pay, that's what he checked. But if you want a financial statement, we have a system that generates the financial statement.
Okay, that
Well-
would suffice for me.
Okay, my question is how lengthy of a process would that be for him to do a financial statement?
It's
Is
right
that-
there.
Is that,
It's already got it.
okay.
The only question I have is, we want to look at, for the citizens, how we're spending the money. And now, we as a council are asking him to spend more money. Is it budgeted to keep spending all this money to do all these revisions? Or do you have a place to get the money?
No, we need to, find out of our budget, finance budget, or if we run out of budget, we have to come to you and say, I need to reappropriation.
And that's what we need to do, because we can ask all we want to ask, but if we don't have the money, he's got to come up with a way to come back to us and tell us where to get the money.
He's got the figures right there. He's
Yes,
telling us.
but we made a promise.
Not on what you're asking to do.
Yeah, he is.
Completely.
And Frank, I think that, and I understand, because that was why I was reluctant, I don't want to be redundant in spending taxpayer money, but we also made a promise to our taxpayers.
I'll be
And
happy
I want
to
to make
show
sure
you and
beyond
see
any
that.
doubt that we are fulfilling that promise.
Okay, let's form a conclusion here, okay? Do you want to have, this is a simple question, an independent of the independent audit just for that fund? Or are you willing to take the independent audit the city's going to get for the general budget and a ledger as acceptable? Mr. Arquez.
I'll take it as accepted.
Ms.
I
Gonzalez?
accept that, but we've never had an issue with
Yes,
that audit.
I would take that as acceptable.
Which
Yes.
one?
I would take it as acceptable that if we have the audit that Mr. Wright has done in conjunction with the city audit, so long as we have some figures to show the taxpayers.
So long as that 1A money, 2A money is broken out, so we
Yes,
can pull
yes,
that out.
Yes.
Ms. Smith?
I feel that even though it's redundant, we need to make sure that that money is looked at independent of the independent audit. It was a promise that was made to our citizens, and I feel like we should go above and beyond to make sure that we fulfill that and make ourselves clear of any criticism. And even if we do have two separate audits, and they both clearly show that the money was spent appropriately, then that's double the power of saying that we are spending our money wisely and appropriately.
Okay.
I'm good with having the audit that we have coupled with an audited financial statement to show where the dollars went. And if we look at that and that does not appear adequate, I think we can revisit it again at that time. But at least get that so that we have that piece that we can put out whatever use we can make of it.
Okay, Mr. Hamrick, to be clear,
Yes.
so what you're saying is you are willing to take this audit right now for the general budget, which we can pull out the 2A money, and then if you're not satisfied with that, we can talk to an independent audit of that. Is that what you're saying?
Yep.
Okay, Mr. Meisner.
we take this audit with Harry's figures, and we got what I wanted, and we got something we could present to the public.
Okay.
That's certified.
Okay.
After next week, we'll be certified.
That,
And let me throw one more option. After the audit is done, and when we put together the financial statement, I'll be happy to make a presentation here and show it to you what the numbers look like and how that tied to the general ledger.
okay, well, let's make Harry happy. Ms. Turner?
Harry's always happy.
Thank you, Harry, for making that offer. I am satisfied that with the audit that Mr. Wright did, the ledger that we'll have then certified with an independent audit next week, I think that's sufficient to meet our burden to the taxpayer.
Okay, you had the final word, by the way, for the
Thank
new
you.
member. So we're going to adjourn and take a 5-minute break, then we'll start the new meeting. Mr. Meisner?
Sir, with council's permission, I'd like to add an agenda item to our next government meeting,
Next,
general
Ne-
government meeting,
next
May 9th.
May 9th?
May 9th.
Yeah, we can add that.
And I would just, what I would like is an update from the police department on their staffing and proposed solutions to that, and to kind of reaffirm some of the ideas that the chief had mentioned in his interview,
Okay,
and just see where we're at there with staffing and solutions.
okay, so done. Now we're adjourned, and we'll take a 5 or 10-minute break, so.